So we're ready for Mechanisms of Evolution Part 3. So let's get started where we left off. I think we left off here. Oh, maybe not. I think we left off here. We focused on natural selection as a mechanism of evolution. Now we're going to move on and talk about other mechanisms of evolution. But before I leave natural selection, I just wanted to make a comment about the video that I've asked you to watch, the Dogs Decoded video. It's a pretty fascinating video that looks at the evolution, or rather the evolution, the co-evolution of humans and dogs, how we have evolved together to have this really unique social relationship, a relationship between two species that's really fascinating. And I'm sure it happens in other species as well, that kind of coevolution. It does. But it's a pretty fascinating video. It focuses on, on how dogs have become humans' best friends, basically. I hope you enjoy the video. Think about coevolution. Think about how we have directed the evolution of dogs using artificial selection over these thousands of years that we have been in contact with them as well. It's just kind of an interesting thing. Okay, there are other mechanisms of evolution besides natural selection. One of those is genetic drift. Genetic drift is another very common mechanism for evolution. By definition, it's the random change in allelic frequencies. So we can write that in if we want to. In allelic, that just means in the genetic makeup. Okay, a random change in the allelic frequencies of a population from generation to generation. This is simply due to chance. Okay? The drift is due to chance events. So just thinking about allelic frequencies, if we had, two alleles for a particular gene, a big A and a little a, and they each had a frequency of 50% or 0.5 in a population, genetic drift could lead to a change in that frequency due to chance. So maybe the big A's would change to 0.48, and the little a's would change to 0.52, okay? A random change due to chance, a chance event. This is most noticeable in populations that are very small. And what that can lead to, in particularly in small populations, is that rare alleles can either be lost altogether and disappear from a population, or rare alleles can become much more common in a small population because of genetic drift. So a major consequence of drift in populations, especially small ones, is that what happens to those rare alleles? They can either be lost altogether or they can become much more common. Here's an example of genetic drift in a flower population, and these flowers have different colors. The colors depend upon, it appears, two different alleles, the R and the W allele. If you have two R's, you're red. If you have two W's, you're white. And if you have one of each, you are pink. And we've got this mixed population over here. If this population, oh, by the way, here's our initial allelic frequencies. There are more reds than whites. If this population breeds, perhaps not all of the members breed because of chance, or perhaps, due to chance events, we get a slight shift in the allelic frequencies. All right? The frequency of R, the frequency of W has changed a bit. This is actually a pretty big change in a single generation. It must be a very small population. In generation 3, we could even see another change, and we could lose altogether the white alleles. And now we have a population of all red plants all the time, unless a new mutation occurs. Genetic drift is like that. Small populations are particularly susceptible to genetic drift. Genetic drift can lead to two different things. One of them is a bottleneck effect, or a bottleneck event. This is a situation in which a population declines dramatically, and the small remnant of the population that's left is not genetically similar to its original parent. So the idea is kind of like a bottleneck. You have this big population that somehow undergoes a drastic reduction in size, and there's only a few members left, and then they start to grow again, and the population grows, but this population, the new population, is very different genetically than the original population. The picture here is showing we've got this big population, but most individuals die, and we're left with just these guys. These guys grow, and we don't have any yellow alleles anymore, okay? This happens all the time, especially in our world where we have, as humans, have devastated populations of particularly big mammals like cheetahs or northern elephant seals or bison or Florida panthers. The population has undergone a dramatic drop in size and gone through a bottleneck, if you will, and the members of the population now are not genetically identical to the original population. They've lost diversity. Here's a good example. These cute little guys called elephant seals. Elephant seals were hunted to near extinction in the 1890s. There were just 20 elephant seals left, as far as we knew. Now there are about 30,000 of them, so they've made a comeback. That's great. But when you look at their genetic diversity, it turns out that researchers studying their diversity have found essentially no genetic diversity at different genes along their genome. They're all identical. They've lost all that genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is what helps a population in times of change, or if a new mutation, a new disease comes along, a new predator. The genetic diversity is useful to have as a population for the population survival. Another good example of that would be bison. Again, we killed off bison in huge numbers. You've seen pictures probably of these stacks of bones of bison. By 1890, must be the 1890s were rough, man. There were only about 750 bison left in the whole of North America. Now there's a lot more, thankfully, right? But this is a bottleneck event, all right? If researchers look at the recovered population and look at the genetics of that population, it's going to look a little bit different than the population did back here before the 1800s. There's going to be lower genetic diversity. Some alleles will have been lost. Some will have become more common. Okay? This is the question that a lot of researchers are asking. A bottleneck event. Another event that happens because of genetic drift is the founder effect. So in this situation, you've got a small number of individuals that decides to leave a parent population. So you got this big parent population, and a few individuals are like, yeah, we got to get out of here, and they go somewhere else. And they found their new population, all right? The founder population is probably different genetically from the original population. So the founder population probably has a different genetic makeup than the parent population, and it's subject to drift because it is so small, okay? So it's different. You can just write genetic makeup here if you want to. That makes sense. And is different and is subject to genetic drift because it is so small. A great example of this in humans would be the Amish populations. The Amish populations left Europe under religious duress, and they moved to America, settling in one region of Pennsylvania, and then they've spread now to Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, Iowa, etc. But there are different populations, small populations of Amish, and Amish are particularly interesting to study because they keep good records of their family trees, so we can follow their genetic history and their family trees, and they typically don't interbreed a lot with other members of the population than the English, is what the Amish call us, the non-Amish community, all right? But what's interesting about these populations is the Amish community has some diseases that crop up at really high rates compared to the rest of the North American population. Amish populations have a higher than normal frequency of some diseases and some alleles that contribute to a variety of different diseases. Polydactyly just means having an extra digits on your fingers or toes or feet. Dwarfism, several other metabolic disorders that are not common at all. They're incredibly rare in other populations, but they're common, or much more common in the Amish. Why is that? Because of the founder effect. Chances are, when this population, when a few people left the population, those few people might have been carrying the rare allele, we'll just call it little a, for a particular disorder like maple syrup urine disease. That's a rare recessive disease. Well, once this individual who had one copy, maybe great-great-grandpa, had this one copy of the recessive A, and passes that little A along, if individuals who are at all related to each other, and in small populations, individuals do interbreed to some extent, if they do, they can pass along both versions of both mutations and have a child with maple syrup urine disease. This allele becomes much more common because of the founder effect, and that is an example of genetic drift. Drift contributes to evolution because it changes the genetic makeup of a population over time. And it's a really important mechanism of evolution, especially in small populations, and that's particularly important in our world today, as a lot of species are threatened and endangered. Here are some other mechanisms of evolution. Gene flow. Gene flow is basically the physical flow of alleles into or out of a population because of immigration or emigration. The idea goes something like this. You have two populations, population A and population B. You might be genetically a little bit diverse, so you have two populations of prairie dogs, or two populations of cheetahs, or two populations of hyenas, whatever it is, right? And some members of the population A decide to emigrate from population A and immigrate to population B. What does that do? Well, it changes the genetic makeup of both populations, right? Especially if these members here happen to have some rare allele that's not found in population A at high levels. Both populations can undergo evolution or change because of gene flow. What's interesting about this is the populations become homogenized. They actually become more similar to each other as more gene flow happens. So if gene flow is happening a lot between these two populations, they should be genetically quite similar to each other. All right? Good examples of gene flow are found in a lot of social animals. So things like prairie dogs have big, huge social communities that they live in. But as young grow up, female young stay in their own colony, their natal colony, and males leave the colony to go to a new one. New males come into the colony to breed and to survive and thrive, and we get gene flow happening. And that happens in a whole variety of species, in which typically males will leave their natal colony and move to another population, increasing gene flow between populations. I guess in mountain gorillas, it goes there's a twist in gender. Females tend to leave their groups and go to other populations, so it's a little bit different. Oh, quick digression with respect to gene flow. There's research on whether or not early humans interbred with Neanderthals. So there's a point in our history where Neanderthals and humans overlapped by thousands of years. The evolution of Neanderthals and humans and modern humans is an overlapping one. Is there evidence that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred and passed genes between each other? there seems to be strong evidence that Neanderthals passed genes to modern humans. In fact, evidence suggests somewhere between 1 to 4% of our genomes, of human genomes, humans who are not of African descent, are basically from Neanderthals. 1 to 4% of human genomes are from Neanderthals, unless you are of African descent. If you are of African descent, Neanderthals and humans in Africa Neanderthals did not evolve until after their ancestors moved out of Africa. And so there were no interbreedings between Neanderthals and people who lived in Africa. And so if you are of African descent, it looks like you have no Neanderthal genes. But if you are of, say, Northern European descent or Mid-Eastern descent, you've got quite a bit of Neanderthal genes. Those are some really interesting articles about that. But remember, it's an example of gene flow and how that can change populations. Another mechanism of evolution are mutations, or is mutation. Mutations are pretty rare events. On average, in a gamete or an egg or a sperm produced, a mutation happens every 1 out of every, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like 1 out of every 100,000 nucleotides. You have a mutation event happening. And when we think of mutations, usually we think of a change in nucleotide sequence. If you're thinking about DNA is made up of nucleotides, and if one nucleotide changes, that's a mutation. You could also have bigger changes, like a piece of a chromosome disappears, or a whole extra chromosome is made, is copied in it. Those are big mutations, and they happen too. Now, mutations usually are neutral, means that they're not, they don't really change a phenotype, or they're harmful. They cause an individual to not survive well or not be able to breed well. In those cases, the mutations, especially if they're harmful, will be selected against. But sometimes a mutation leads to an individual with increased survivorship or increased ability to reproduce. So let's just write down increased survivorship here, or possibly increased ability to reproduce. Then that mutation, then individuals with that mutation are going to be selected for over time. And a population could shift over time to include more individuals with that mutation, with that particular phenotype. A really great example of a mutation that has been strongly selected for in humans is lactose tolerance in adults. Now, just for a quick note, lactose is a type of sugar found in milks and in dairy milk, cows and goats, in milk. It's a sugar, and it can be broken down in babies. Babies have an enzyme called lactase that have the ability to break it down. In a lot of human populations across the globe, adults lose that ability to break down lactose. They basically make the enzyme less and less and less, so they become less tolerant of lactose as they grow older. When they are 3 or 4 or 5, they stop making that enzyme and can't tolerate lactose. It causes digestive problems, it can cause diarrhea, it can be problematic. But lactose tolerance seems to have evolved in at least 3 separate human populations in the last 10,000 years. Those populations were all people who had domesticated cattle. So we've got a population, and this is kind of the map, in Northern Europe, in Western Africa, and kind of in the Middle East. Right? Turns out that there are 3 different mutations in each of these groups of people that allow adults to keep making the enzyme lactase. To keep making the enzyme lactase means you're going to have the ability to keep digesting lactose as an older child, as an adult. And it looks like these mutations arose somewhere between 3 and 10,000 years ago. Those are not very old. but then were strongly selected for in these populations. They gave people an enormous selective advantage because now a lot of people have lactose tolerance as adults. Here's kind of an interesting thing. Researchers believe that people with lactose tolerance left behind 10 times more offspring than those without lactose tolerance, telling us that lactose tolerance must have been strongly selected for in these populations. And so over time, we have more and more individuals with lactose tolerance. Why do you think lactose tolerance was so strongly selected for? Maybe having the ability to find nutrition in times of drought, being able to digest and tolerate milk products when there's really not a lot of other things to eat could be really important. If you tried those milk products and you couldn't digest them, chances are you would have diarrhea, which would be contributing to an early death. So we don't know exactly why, but here we've got mutations that are strongly selected for. And 3 independent, different mutations seem to have arisen that have been strongly selected for, actually, the ability to digest lactose has been strongly selected for, and it depends upon these 3 mutations. So it's a pretty cool example in humans of how mutations can lead to a change in the evolutionary, a change in the genetic makeup of the population over time. Just a thought, are humans still evolving? What do you think? Do you think our populations are still changing over time? I think we'd probably have to say, well, certainly mutations are happening, for sure. Gene flow. Well, gene flow between populations is at probably an all-time high. We have kind of a global population almost at this point. And I don't know about drift. We have, like I said, a global population and maybe less opportunity for drift, except among populations like that are intentionally isolating themselves, like the Amish, or populations of indigenous peoples that are very isolated from societies, populations of people living in, say, the Amazon might undergo drift to some extent. What about natural selection? Are there phenotypes that are being selected for in our population or selected against? Or is selection less important because we've got so much technology and we've got medicine now that will, really probably kind of protects us from the harshness of the environment? I mean, shoot, it used to be probably that it wouldn't be so good if you didn't have good eyesight. No. Having the best of eyesight isn't critical anymore to survival or to reproductive success. Maybe our technologies have sheltered us from selection. Right? That's it. That's the mechanisms of evolution, and I think we now have some understanding of how evolution can happen. We're going to focus on the evolution of social behavior in this particular class, and so we're going to be thinking more and more about, as we move through this class, about social behaviors. And if we understand how evolution works, I think it'll help us understand more about social behavior in general. And so we'll talk to you soon.